On June 4th, 1943, Railroad Street in Mexia, Texas, became the unlikely stage for one of the greatest ideological demolitions of the 20th century, a collapse not wrought by bombs or bullets, but by the raw spectacle of abundance, efficiency, and modernity. As the train screeched to a halt under the humid night sky, Unifitzia ver Burkhart's pencil trembled in his secret diary, recording thoughts that would have condemned him to solitary confinement had his officers uncovered them. The Americans must be lying to us. No nation fighting on two fronts could live like this. Yet through the train window, he had just seen what shattered 3 years of Nazi propaganda. Electric lights shining from every farmhouse, shop, and street corner, blazing across the Texas plains like constellations at 10 o'clock at night. Since 1940, blackout orders had plunged Germany into darkness. And before the war even began, fewer than 1 in 5 German farms had electricity. Yet here, in a nation Nazi officials had portrayed as decadent and collapsing, electricity poured out as effortlessly as water. When the 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped down from their passenger cars, the shock deepened, for these were no cattle cars or drafty freight wagons, but cushioned Pullman coaches with dining service, sleeping berths, even observation cars. The entire town of Mahia had gathered to watch their arrival, unaware that this moment marked the start of the most profound psychological transformation in modern military history, a steady dismantling of Nazi ideology accomplished not by lectures or threats, but by simple exposure to American prosperity. The collapse of illusions had begun weeks earlier, on May 13, 1943, in Tunisia, when General Jurgen von Arnim, Rommel's replacement, surrendered 250,000 Axis troops, the Wehrmacht's most seasoned desert fighters, men who had forced the British to the gates of Egypt and earned Montgomery's grudging respect, now reduced to prisoners awaiting transport. Among them was Feldwebel Friedrich Radke, decorated with the Iron Cross First Class, twice wounded in Africa, whose diary would later provide historians with extraordinary detail on how captivity in America destroyed Nazi assumptions. The journey began in Oran, Algeria, where Radke and 30,000 fellow prisoners were herded into makeshift camps to await transport ships. Even here, before setting foot in America, German soldiers encountered a logistical competence that shook their faith. Thousands processed daily with photographic IDs, medical exams, inoculations, and explanations of Geneva Convention rights, all carried out by American officers who spoke flawless German, having been trained in advance for this very task. The first real shock, however, came at mealtime. Oberstfreiter Hans Muller of the 21st Panzer Division, later writing home, recalled being given white bread, real coffee, and meat twice a day, meals superior to anything they had eaten in 6 months of desert warfare. At first they assumed this was propaganda theater meant to impress them, but then they realized this was simply the standard U.S. Army ration. The ships that carried them across the Atlantic were themselves revelations of industrial power. Liberty ships like the SS Robert E. Peary, assembled in just 4 days and 15 hours at Kaiser's Richmond yards, would have been dismissed as propaganda had the prisoners known. Built at a rate of 3 per day, the 2,710 Liberty ships were logistical miracles, returning from European supply runs laden not with ballast, but with German prisoners, 30,000 per month by summer 1943. During the July crossings, Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann of the 90th Light Division wrote that the crew discarded more food waste daily than his entire company had received in a week at the war's end. Half-eaten steaks, whole loaves of bread, gallons of spoiled milk, all tossed aside without malice, simply because the supply seemed limitless. More shocking still, they learned each ship required 250,000 components drawn from factories in 32 states, its engines assembled from standardized parts built simultaneously in separate plants, and each fitted with radar equipment the Germans had believed rare, even in their own navy. To Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm von Stobern, scion of a Prussian family with centuries of martial service, this single revelation, that radar was so commonplace in America it adorned merchant ships, was enough to convince him Germany had already lost the war. When, on August 2, 1943, The prisoners finally disembarked at Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The spectacle annihilated the last shreds of Nazi propaganda about American weakness. Norfolk's sprawl of 4,300 acres dwarfed German ports, with cranes unloading dozens of ships simultaneously, tonnage exceeding Hamburg's weekly capacity accomplished in a single day. Prisoners marched past parking lots overflowing with civilian automobiles, a sight unthinkable in Germany, where private cars remained luxuries for the party elite. The Volkswagen promise stillborn, with barely 1,000 delivered. Then came the trains, not cramped cattle wagons, but full Pullman coaches with padded seats, white tablecloth dining cars, and even air conditioning. Radke wrote with disbelief that the guards apologized the cooling system was not functioning properly. Until that moment, he had believed such comfort existed only in Hitler's personal train. For 3 days, as the trains rolled south toward Texas and Oklahoma, German prisoners pressed their faces to the glass, confronted at every turn with evidence that Nazi portrayals of America as degenerate and collapsing were grotesque lies. Towns like Martinsville, Danville, and Greensboro, which in Germany would have been lucky to illuminate a single street, glowed with electric signage and multiple rooms lit in every home. Factories hummed on night shifts. Parking lots jammed, even past midnight. Railway yards bristling with automated coal loaders, electric pumps, and mechanized lubrication systems that reduced 2 hours' work to 30 minutes. The casual wealth of the workers stunned them. Leather boots costing months of German wages, Coca-Cola swig from glass bottles and discarded without thought, cigarettes smoked half-finished and flicked away. One engineer calculated that a single American rail yard used more electricity in an hour than his Berlin district consumed in a day. As the trains rumbled deeper into Tennessee and Kentucky, past vast aluminum and rubber plants dwarfing anything German industry had managed, past Ford's Willow Run facility producing a bomber every 63 minutes, past Mississippi barges carrying more grain than entire German harvests, the prisoners realized with horror that every Nazi assurance about America had been a fabrication. By the time they reached the cattle stockyards of Kansas City, watching American workers eat beef sandwiches thicker than their weekly rations, the psychological demolition was almost complete. What began in Mexia, Texas, as astonishment at streetlights became, mile by mile, a complete collapse of faith in Nazi propaganda, because the evidence was everywhere, relentless and undeniable. When the Afrika Korps prisoners finally marched under guard into Camp Mahia, they were prepared for brutality, starvation, and humiliation, the images German propaganda had drilled into them of America's treatment of captives. Instead, they encountered something profoundly disorienting: respect, order, and even courtesy. The camp, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, was laid out like a small town, complete with barracks, a hospital, mess halls, sports fields, workshops, and classrooms. Within days, they learned that U.S. Army policy, adhering to the Geneva Convention, guaranteed them the same daily rations as American soldiers: 3 meals of meat, vegetables, fruit, milk, and coffee, with bread baked fresh in the camp's own ovens. Many prisoners found themselves healthier in captivity than they had been in Africa. For men who had marched across deserts on half rations, the shock of being well-fed while in enemy hands was almost impossible to reconcile with Nazi depictions of America as a land of decay. Even more destabilizing was the treatment by guards. Texan farm boys and Midwestern clerks, many barely older than the prisoners themselves, carried rifles but addressed them with a matter-of-fact fairness, enforcing discipline without cruelty. When fights broke out between Nazi loyalists and those already wavering in their faith, guards separated them rather than punishing the group collectively, a stark contrast to German military discipline. Work details became another revelation. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be required to perform non-military labor, and soon they were contracted out to nearby farms, cotton gins, sawmills, and road crews. Paid in scrip redeemable at the camp canteen, they discovered not only a measure of economic freedom, but also exposure to American civilians. Farmers greeted them with curiosity, sometimes with suspicion, but often with friendliness, offering meals at kitchen tables, cold lemonade in fields, even cigarettes as gestures of goodwill. Feldwebel Radke wrote that he could not comprehend why a farmer's wife in Texas, whose husband was away fighting Germans in North Africa, would nonetheless treat a German prisoner with kindness. Such moments eroded Nazi propaganda more effectively than any formal re-education program ever could. Prisoners noticed the prosperity of American farms, tractors larger than any machine they had seen, barns wired with electricity, families with radios in every room. A single harvest wage for a teenage farmhand equaled a German officer's monthly pay. They saw teenagers driving pickup trucks, women managing businesses in town, and local schools where girls studied mathematics alongside boys, scenes that undercut the Nazi worldview at its foundations. Letters home deepened the cracks. Though censored, prisoners could write freely enough to describe meals, work, and health. Families in Germany, struggling with ration cards and nightly bombings, could scarcely believe their sons and brothers were gaining weight in enemy camps. Some accused them of exaggerating. Others pleaded for details, and slowly word spread across German towns that captivity in America was preferable to survival at the front. Back inside the camps, cultural life flourished. The U.S. Army permitted theaters, orchestras, and newspapers, reasoning that idle prisoners were more dangerous than occupied ones. Within months, orchestras performed Beethoven, choirs sang Schubert, and amateur actors staged Goethe and Schiller. Libraries stocked with German classics allowed study, while educational programs offered English lessons, mathematics, and vocational training. For younger prisoners, it was the first sustained exposure to intellectual freedom, a contrast to Nazi indoctrination. Even sports became transformative. Soccer leagues formed, but baseball introduced by guards fascinated many, with its pace, fairness, and absence of rigid hierarchy. A game where even the weakest could score through patience and teamwork. Still, the ideological battle inside the wire was fierce. Hardcore Nazis, organized in secret cells, sought to enforce loyalty through intimidation, sometimes beating or even murdering those who voiced admiration for America. In Camp Mahia, one prisoner suspected of betrayal was found hanged in a shower stall, staged as suicide. Yet the very existence of such violence revealed how fragile Nazi belief had become. By late 1944, U.S. authorities began separating diehards from moderates, sending the most fanatical to isolated compounds in the Arizona desert. The majority, however, drifted steadily toward disillusionment. Each payday and canteen script brought purchases of Coca-Cola, candy, or American cigarettes, luxuries unimaginable in Germany. Each newspaper article, allowed under supervision, revealed Allied victories at odds with Nazi radio broadcasts. Each work detail brought conversations with ordinary Americans who seemed neither decadent nor weak, but practical, confident, and prosperous. In one Texas town, prisoners were taken to help harvest cotton, and when a storm forced them to shelter in a church, they were astonished to see black and white Americans worshiping together. A sight that, though not free from America's own racial contradictions, nonetheless contrasted sharply with Nazi racial dogma. The longer captivity stretched, the more comparisons piled up. Germany's crumbling cities under nightly firestorms seemed ever more distant from the clean, well-fed, and unbroken landscape around them. Rumors spread that prisoners in Britain or Canada endured harsher conditions, that those held in Russia starved, and thus America's treatment stood out as uniquely humane. By the time Christmas 1943 arrived, with prisoners allowed to decorate trees and sing carols, many felt an uneasy gratitude, unable to reconcile their sworn allegiance with the kindness of their captors. This inner conflict became the quiet revolution of the camps, an erosion of loyalty not forced by propaganda, but by lived experience, by the daily realization that the decadent democracy they had been taught to despise was, in fact, stronger, freer, and wealthier than the Reich could ever be. By 1945, as Allied armies pressed into Germany and the Reich tottered, the transformation inside America's POW camps was nearly complete. The men who had arrived defiant and unbroken, now passed their days in study, labor, music, and reflection, most no longer clinging to illusions of German superiority. When news of Hitler's death reached the camps in late April, it was greeted not with grief, but with stunned silence, followed by an almost palpable sense of release. Guards reported that many prisoners walked about dazed, whispering that the nightmare was over. With Germany's surrender, the fate of nearly 371,000 German POWs held across the United States turned toward repatriation. Yet their departure was not immediate. Thousands remained through 1946, contracted out to harvest cotton, cut timber, or rebuild infrastructure, tasks critical to America's wartime labor shortage. For many, the extra year deepened their exposure to American life. In towns across Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and the Midwest, friendships quietly blossomed. Some prisoners played music at local dances. Others exchanged recipes or carpentry skills, and more than a few fell in love, leaving behind bittersweet attachments when the time came to go home. When trains finally carried them eastward in 1946, and ships bore them across the Atlantic, they returned not as the same men who had been captured in Tunisia, but as men who had lived inside a different civilization. The contrast awaiting them was brutal. Germany lay in ruins, entire cities flattened, factories silent, millions homeless, and food rations a fraction of what they had eaten as captives. Families were gaunt, clothes patched beyond repair, children stunted by malnutrition. Letters written from Germany in late 1946 speak of prisoners breaking down in tears when they realized their loved ones had endured worse conditions as free civilians than they themselves had faced behind barbed wire. Some even concealed the truth, ashamed to admit they had been healthier, safer, and better fed in enemy hands than their families in the Reich. And yet, the ideas they carried back mattered. The quiet comparisons between American abundance and German deprivation, between democratic freedoms and Nazi lies, formed seeds that would shape post-war Germany. Many POWs returned determined never again to submit to propaganda without question. Others spoke openly of their experiences, describing towns where electricity lit every farm, where food seemed limitless, where even ordinary workers enjoyed wealth unthinkable in Germany. In the devastated beer halls of 1947 and 1948, such stories circulated widely, planting the notion that Germany's future lay not in resurrecting authoritarian glory, but in embracing the material prosperity and civic freedoms glimpsed in America. Scholars later traced threads of West Germany's democratic resilience to this very influence. Hundreds of thousands of former soldiers who, in captivity, had seen another model of life and returned to share it. The legacy of the POW camps was thus paradoxical. Intended simply to house and employ captured enemies, they became classrooms of comparative civilization, their lesson delivered not through lectures, but through the undeniable evidence of daily life. For men like Feldwebel Friedrich Radke and Feldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, the sight of Norfolk's vast port or the taste of fresh white bread in a Texas field was more persuasive than any Allied leaflet. When these men sat decades later with grandchildren, describing the war, they often dwelt less on the battles of El Alamein or Kasserine than on the shock of their imprisonment in America. The discovery that the enemy they had been told was weak, decadent, and corrupt was in fact strong, confident, and generous. And so the collapse of Nazi ideology, which no bomb could fully achieve, was completed quietly inside barbed wire enclosures thousands of miles from the Reich, accomplished by electricity glowing on farmhouses at midnight, by meals of meat and milk served to defeated soldiers, by the fairness of young guards, and by the simple, relentless contrast between lies told in Germany and truths lived in America. When they stepped off ships onto the rubble-strewn docks of Bremerhaven and Hamburg, carrying thin suitcases and heavy memories, they did not return as conquerors, nor even as defeated soldiers alone, but as witnesses whose experiences would help shape a new Germany built not on the illusions of the past, but on the reality they had glimpsed in captivity.